Now, Public Law 280, you've all heard about it, right? No?
Yes.
Raise your hand if you've heard about Public Law 280. Okay, most of us have. But do we know the depth of Public Law 280? Probably not. Public Law 280 was enacted in 1953. And I always call it the trigger legislation for the termination of the sovereignty of Indian tribes nationwide. And termination started with House Resolution 108. And it was offered up by a senator from Utah who was very hostile towards Indians. Usually the Indians are hostile towards somebody else, but in this situation, he wanted to get rid of the tribal sovereignty status. And the way that he talked about it in House Resolution 108 was he wanted to free the Indians from federal domination, from federal dominion. And so the only way to do that was to sever the relationship, the special government-to-government relationship, trust relationship, and the treaties that tribes had with the United States of America. That was the agenda. Now, Public Law 280 essentially was a piece of legislation where we were going to start somewhere. The federal government was going to start somewhere with regard to beginning the termination process. And there were 5 states and 1 territory at that time that were slated for Public Law 280 jurisdiction, mandatory jurisdiction. California was one, Wisconsin was another, Minnesota was another, except for the Red Lake Reservation in Minnesota. Oregon was another one, except for the Warm Springs Reservation in Oregon. And Alaska. Alaska in 1953 was still a territory. It later became a state, I think, in 1958, not too far after Public Law 280 was enacted. Now, in the mandatory states, well, first of all, you probably asked the question, and you don't want to bother with it later, why was the Warm Springs Reservation exempted, and why was the Red Lake Reservation exempted? Politics. They had, Warm Springs had an attorney in a law firm that was very influential in politics in the state of Oregon, and in Minnesota, the Red Lake chair at that time was very influential in politics at the national level, and his name was Roger Jourdain. He was one of our famous tribal leaders over the years, and he got Red Lake to be exempted. Metlakatla, there was one other one, Metlakatla in the territory of Alaska was exempted from Public Law 280. But everybody else became subject to Public Law 280 in those mandatory states. And what did that mean? That meant there was going to be a transfer of certain kinds of jurisdiction in the civil sector to the states involved, these mandatory states like California, and there was going to be a transfer of federal criminal jurisdiction to those states. So California became a state wherein certain civil jurisdiction was transferred to the state of California, as well as criminal jurisdiction. So what did that mean? In 1953, those of us who were around then, I'm probably the only one in the room who was around in 1953, you shake your head. You were there with me. But you were a little boy like me. I was 13 in 1953, so I didn't know a heck of a lot. But little by little I did. Were you 13 or over, or what? You were 13 too? Very good. So in 1953, the termination process began. And it wasn't just Public Law 280. It was this thing called Indian relocation. There was an effort in the late 50s and the early 60s to convince Indian people to leave the reservation and come to the big cities in order to pursue the American dream. But for the most part, the Indians who went on relocation, mainly from the Public Law 280 states, but this involved all of Indian country, because this was a policy of termination. Even though it started with these mandatory states, it was going to encompass all of Indian country. So one of the best things to do is to get the Indians off the reservation so that the non-Indians could take over with leases and so forth, and maybe even purchase to some degree. But I went on relocation in 1960. And I went from a small town in Northern California to the big city of San Francisco. I'd never been there before. In those days, it was like almost a 4-hour drive. Today, you can zip down there in 2 hours or less. But in those days, you had to take the old Greyhound bus. Greyhound bus was big in those days. It's not big any longer. But I arrived in the big city, and it was a culture shock to me to some degree. But, you know, I had grown up going to public schools, so I knew a little bit more than some of my colleagues who were on relocation that went to BIA boarding schools and were on major reservations. The little rancheria that I grew up on had only about 90 to 100 acres. These guys had millions of acres on their reservations at Pine Ridge and Navajo and Tohono O'odham, which was Papago in those days. But we were told that what we could do was take a vocational training course and get a certificate, and we'd be job ready. And those who didn't need training, employment assistance was part of the relocation program. Well, jobs for Indians who came into the city from outside was hard to get, even though you did complete a program of vocational training where you got a certificate. Because when you went to get a job, the first place you made contact with was the union office. And if you didn't have a connection to the union office, either through family or through an employer that had already hired you, you couldn't get anywhere. So a lot of Indian folks got frustrated. A lot of domestic violence happened, a lot of alcohol and drug abuse, and suicides. And for the most part, it became a disaster. And it was very unfortunate because there were one-way tickets from Pine Ridge to California to San Francisco. So you had to find your own way back home, your own ticket home, if you will. So a lot of the Indian folks that went to relocation in the San Francisco Bay Area or in the Los Angeles area in California stayed. And they went from one poverty situation in Indian country to another poverty situation in the big city. And over the years, there are still a lot of Indians in the big city that came on that relocation program, and their children, generations of young people who have no connection with their tribal land. They are distant from their tribal land. And it's a difficult situation. Termination, in California, 41 rancherias were terminated on their face. And today, most of those rancherias are reinstated as Indian country and Indian people. Our little rancheria was terminated in the 60s, and we are now reinstated. So we went from being non-Indian during the termination era to being restored as Indians. But what does that mean? It doesn't mean that much to me in my psyche. It did mean a lot to my grandparents in that generation, because they didn't know why they were being terminated. They didn't know why they were being told that they are not who they thought they were, that their Indianness didn't mean anything, that in order to be a good American, you had to leave that behind. And to folks who were rich in their culture and language, that was a terrible situation, I think, emotionally. And I know my grandfather and my grandmother, both on my mom's side, went to their graves without ever knowing what termination did to them. So a lot of Indians sort of perished. They didn't die in any dignified fashion. They perished because of federal Indian policy at that time. Well, termination left us with a declaration by Richard Nixon in 1971. He essentially said that he was interested in rejecting the termination policies and moving forward with a policy of self-determination. And that's where we're at today, self-determination. I don't think Richard Nixon was really, I don't want to offend any Republicans in the room. I don't think Richard Nixon was in love with Indians. I do think that you've all heard of the Alcatraz occupation back in 70, 71. And that occupation that was created by Indian students from San Francisco State, from UC Berkeley, and from UCLA, got the attention of the local media. It got the attention of the statewide media, got the attention of the national media, and then the international media within a short period of time. And in doing so, because we were in the Cold War situation in those days, the question was asked internationally, what is the United States doing to the first Americans? And I really think that was the reason why Richard Nixon declared no more termination, let's follow a path of self-determination for Native American. There has been no treatise written on this, although you'll see an article or two every now and then. But I was going to UC Berkeley at the time of Alcatraz and went over there a couple of times, but I didn't stay at any length of time. But a lot of my colleagues went back and forth, my fellow students. But they were really excited about what they were doing. They weren't excited about the philosophy and the substance of what they were doing as much as the excitement and the media attention. You know, that was a lot of fun. But unknown to them, they made history because they changed federal policy, I believe, and we're now dealing with self-determination. And then along after that came the phenomenon of Indian gaming. And so things changed positively for the government-to-government relationship with the United States. But termination went downriver. They didn't take Public Law 280 and throw it out the window. It's still here. It's still causing some problems. There are folks in law enforcement who struggle with Public Law 280. There are folks in law enforcement who have a good grasp of Public Law 280, but it is not a statewide familiarity and a working relationship with Public Law 280. And the question is, why should it be? Why isn't Public Law 280 repealed? Well, the answer to that is there are a couple of law professors who have influenced Public Law 280 by writing law review articles and making speeches about let's tweak it here and tweak it there instead of throwing it out the window. We could have that same relationship with the federal government that was there previously and then enter into partnerships like we're talking about today with state agencies. But the situation, the landscape is confusing, I think, especially in the area of sheriff's departments across California. I think that there needs to be a lot of education, both of folks in law enforcement as well as tribal folks. You know, all of us in this room really don't know the full parameters of Public Law 280 and what it means and what it would be like if it wasn't there. Keep in mind, Public Law 280 was part of termination. So Public Law 280 is something that we have to deal with. It would be nice if it was repealed, but it's not.